Hi, I'm Pastor Steve Talmage of Love of Christ Lutheran Church in Mesa, Arizona. Each week, Pastor Nanette Christofferson and I seek to provide a brief introduction into the upcoming Bible readings assigned to the given Sunday. Today, in this video, I want to introduce you to our gospel reading for Sunday, October 11th. And it's Matthew. It's found in Matthew 22, verses 1 to 14. It's been called the parable of the wedding banquet. At the very start of this reading, verse 1, we read, "Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables." Matthew records Jesus providing a series of parables directed toward, but also heard by a larger audience, directed toward the chief priests and the elders, his chief critics and his opponents, as he continues in his last week of his life and public ministry in Jerusalem. He's seeking to communicate through these stories what the kingdom of heaven is like. A parable is a story that uses everyday characters, everyday scenes. So Jesus' audience, when they hear Jesus tell a story, they could imagine in their own minds the type of people, the scenes, the events happening. Except whenever Jesus would tell these stories, as he tries to convey one spiritual truth, he'll often use exaggeration or a surprising twist to really hammer home the point that he's trying to make. The context. For the last several weeks, we have been with Jesus. And here, as we've listened to him tell parables, he's in the temple square. Holy Week, as we call it, started with Jesus coming in on Palm Sunday, and then he goes back and forth into the temple area. We've had him overturn the money changer tables. Then we heard him tell a story about two sons, one who said he would listen to his father and didn't, and another who said he wouldn't and he did. And then we heard last week the story or parable of the wicked tenants. In chapter 21, preceding our reading for this Sunday, we read, "When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet." This is the second time that the religious elite find themselves paralyzed by fear to speak, fear to act, because they recognize that Jesus has a base of support among these religious pilgrims and his circle of disciples, and they dare not disrupt that crowd for fear of the consequences of Pontius Pilate for disrupting the peace. In verse 2, we hear Jesus begin to tell the story. "The kingdom reign commonwealth of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son." Weddings in Jesus' day were big family and community events that would last up to a week. Jesus' first miracle was at such a scene there in the little town of Canaan, where he turned those jugs of water into wine in John 2. It was a big deal to be invited and, more importantly, to show up. This story gets elevated because this wedding banquet is being hosted, put on by a king. So you can imagine the guest list and the display that will take place. Verse 3. "The king sent his slaves. The invitations were personally hand-delivered by the servants of the king to the appropriate guests." But oddly, in this verse we read, in this story we hear, they would not come. Then in verse 4, again, he sent other slaves, telling them, tell those who have been invited, "Look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet." How many kings have you heard of that would send another round of invitations to his original guest list who rejected the first invitation. The appeal seeks to tantalize them with the luxury of food being prepared. Our imagination might take us to the pomp and circumstance of some 20th or 21st century royal weddings, that of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, or their two boys, William and Harry's wedding. No expense would be spared, only the best would be offered. But then in verse 5, what do we read? But they made light of the invitation and went away. In Jesus' day, no one in their right mind would blow off one, let alone two invitations to an event being hosted by the king. There are always severe consequences. What might cause them to make light or walk away? Well, we read, one went to the farm, another to his business. Even today, many we might know are overwhelmed with a preoccupation with day-to-day responsibilities that cause them to think they can never stop for something that might really be important. There's always cows to milk, chores to get done, another customer or order to attend to. Missing important events have lasting consequences, but we know how easy it is to justify we may have more important things to do. Then verse 6, we see another group of invitees. While the rest of these invitees then seized the slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Jesus often uses strong exaggeration to make a point. This reaction to a simple invitation to join in the king's celebration of his son's wedding is over the top. The response of the king is to be expected. Verse 7. The king was enraged. Rage comes out of the reptilian part of our brain, that part that overrides any kind of rational thought or control. Acts of violence always begin in this part of our brain. Then we read, he sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. The consequence of the violent refusal results in more of an Old Testament eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth response. Some scholars indicate as Matthew was written to an audience that knew about or even survived the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Many saw that devastation because of the judgment of God due to the rejection of the religious elite in accepting what Jesus sought to reveal. But as we read, the party must go on. If the first chosen to come to that party refuse the opportunity, the king will find others to enjoy his hospitality. Verse 9, invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet. The king will not be stopped from celebrating his son's wedding. One of the primary images in the gospel accounts is that of Jesus being the bridegroom, and the people of Israel are portrayed as the bride. Notice the slaves or servants are sent out to the main streets of the surrounding area. Verse 10, they gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. It is important to see in these two verses that the king is the one extending the invitation. Those receiving the invitation have no grounds to claim they deserve to be invited or earn the right to be invited. The invitation comes as a surprise, as a clear extension of gracious hospitality. One commentator indicated that amid Jesus' story, the city from where these folks were gathered or had been reached by the king's slave has been burned to the ground. So in many ways, they are people without homes. They've seen great devastation and will be eager to receive the bounty the king is extending. Verses 11 to 13 are very troubling. Many have tried to explain the harsh reaction by the king to the one guest who failed or refused to wear a wedding robe. Frankly, I'm not too impressed with the hot-headedness of the king in this story, and we need to be careful to project this temperament of the king onto our image of God. The Bible reiterates that God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. One interpretation of this ending of the story is that it really is about grace. The free, unexpected, unearned, and undeserved invitation to trust in God's love revealed through Jesus. The wedding guest who did not don the wedding robe wanted to come to the party on his terms rather than the king's. If this story is about the kingdom of heaven, how does this impact the way we imagine what heaven will be like? How might this affect our understanding of God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven? If we're unwilling to rely on God's grace, what else might gain us access to the wedding feast that has no end? When we join in the feast of the heavenly banquet, will you and I be surprised at who just might be sitting next to us? I hope this will prepare you for the reading and for the preaching of this text wherever you might be worshiping this coming week. May God bless you.